Jim Walmsley, it is an absolute pleasure to have you back on the Singletrack Podcast. How are you doing today?
I'm doing good. It's evening right now, and just kind of winding down.
Right on. Well, yeah, you're about a month removed from an absolute dogfight at Western States this past June. I guess technically it was a come from behind win in the sense that Rod sort of had you on the ropes at some times. It was pretty back and forth. I think Jared sort of tested you back in 2019, but it was different in the sense that he was never in sight. And, effectively most of your Western States wins have been time trials, or you've kind of been operating on a different level from the rest of the field. I know you can't take any day for granted, but in retrospect, were you planning or expecting to be pushed the way you were by the rest of the field?
I thought the field for Western States was really competitive, and I kind of wasn't sure what to expect if everyone would choose to go out harder. And I think it was a mix of everyone starting out, playing it a little more risky, wanting to take risks to win, and that ends up like mixing it up a lot more. So I think it was one of the scenarios I saw. I'm not sure, like I predicted, Rod being there so late, like that was a bit surprising, but also I think he was coming in super hot from Canyons, and it's kind of showing the form that he's on this year. So I think he was just kind of rolling really well and kept that momentum going that he's been having this year.
This could just be an observation from a fan. Like, I'm not in the trenches like you are or other athletes of your caliber are, but it seems to me that more athletes are preparing as deeply as you have historically prepared for races like Western States. They're taking it just as seriously from like a logistics standpoint, nailing aid stations, etc. Once upon a time, maybe you had more intensity, you had more focus in this respect, but it doesn't seem like you have that particular advantage anymore. First, I'd love to get your thoughts on, like, does it feel like a whole new ball game in recent years from a preparation standpoint? Like the field is more equal?
I think there's more experience going on. Like I think there's more athletes committing to ultra than when I first got in. I think when I first got in, it was a bit of a new wave. It was kind of, I guess, in some ways, like Rob Carr started struggling with some injuries, and he was kind of dominating for 2-3 years, and there wasn't really someone that stepped directly into his place. And I would say there were a few years of people in the sport maybe learning ultra for a bit before like people got more dialed in on how to run 100 milers and really focusing in on that. So I would say perhaps it was just a interesting time to enter. I think you look at Rob, Hal, Tim, Scott Jurek, like they were taking it just as serious for sure. So I mean, I don't think that's necessarily revolutionary or changed, but the number of people probably taking it that serious and being that committed, and just talented enough and dedicated and putting in everything, there's definitely a bigger depth now. So you don't know if it's going to be you and a couple guys or you and 10, 20 guys. So yeah, I mean, we had at least 15 through the first 10, 15 miles at Western States that you kind of look back and see a lot of people behind you or in front of you, and you're just kind of in a training line, going through, I guess that's the Red Star Ridge or Lions Ridge, one of the, whichever one's first. I mean, everybody was going through, and that was one of the first things of just trying to get a couple seconds on everyone because I knew I was doing a little bit of a water fill up, and I was going to lose some time. So, but that was actually the one of, I think it was 2000. Yeah, one of the years, one of the early years of running Western States was, I think I miscounted how many calories I had, and I needed to go get more calories at the first aid station. So it like kind of developed into a bit of an attack, and then all of a sudden I was just going, and afterwards kind of racing from there. But yeah, it's kind of funny how we think sometimes the sport's developing and this and that, but it's smaller footsteps forward than probably what we see just in the moment.
I do remember, and We had Dylan Bowman in studio during Western States Week, and he remarked that, when he was finishing 3rd, 5th, 7th in that like 2012 to 2014 era, like topical cooling wasn't even a consideration. So maybe, and again, I
think
can't
this year is
speak
the
to.
first year of using like the terminology topical cooling. I think it was you guys coining that after my interview. You started asking people those questions, and I think I would have to ask for a definition of topical cooling in general.
Well, I've also, just having checked out Tom Evans' new podcast, their Ultrasound, he's been saying that he's not even sure topical cooling is the solution. Everything he's doing is based on like core body temp stuff and like inhaling ice and whatnot to get his stomach to shave off a few degrees. So beyond defining topical cooling, I think I'm not even sure whether it's internal, external we have to be focusing on. But I watched your post-race I Run Far interview after Western States, and one of the things that you mentioned there that sort of perked my interest was that you stuck with the same system this year, sort of across the board as years past. And then you also said there might be ways that you would adjust that, if you ever came back, like you'd carry gear and nutrition more efficiently. Can you share some ways you're thinking about changing things up for future Western States?
Yeah, I think it's pretty obvious I need to clean up my aid stations comparatively. I'm just like I lost a bunch of time to Jared in 2019, but yeah, that was kind of one guy and didn't see him all day. It was just kind of the scaredness of knowing, so like everyone giving you splits that someone's not far behind you, but I never saw him. Whereas this year, like definitely was going into aid stations before Rod and then leaving 2-3 minutes behind and then having to make that time up, and luckily having the legs to be able to kind of eat back chunks of time like that. But at the same time, that's not going to happen every time, and to give away free time is not so not the smartest strategy.
So you're not making any fundamental changes like pack versus belt or shoes. It's really a question of like spending less time in the chair at
I think
whatever
like
last chance.
the bandana needs to get reinvented, I would say. Like essentially, how you carry ice needs to be streamlined and made fast. And outside of that, you can make everything pretty quick. I had the problems with my feet all day and having to switch socks and shoes. That just was kind of an early problem and something I had to deal with at aid station. So kind of ate a lot of time changing shoes at several aid stations.
I've heard you say, and maybe this actually plays into being able to recoup any losses at aid transitions, but I've heard you say recently that mentally you're experiencing one of your finest seasons to date. And I'd love to hear you talk more about this, especially, given that you're in your mid 30s now, whether it's a timely benefit in the sense that maybe you don't have like the same physical resources you once did. Maybe you're not going as hard in workouts or ripping certain segments in Flagstaff with sort of the same reckless abandon. So talk more about that if you don't mind.
Yeah, I think in general I'm a lot more patient. I don't mind the pace slowing down. I don't mind. I kind of know whether someone takes a couple minutes at an edition that, well, if they're not continuing to maintain or keep putting on time, then all of a sudden we have to multiply that by 20, 30, 40 miles. And all of a sudden it's like, well, okay, I can come back. And all of a sudden they make a mistake and there goes a minute. A lot of stuff does happen, and it's all about kind of the sum game, not really just the plus and minuses in the moment. You got to look at where you're gaining time as well and kind of keeping track of that and just knowing that throughout the whole race, you got to end up positive. So there's a lot more patience with that. Especially as you go from Western States to other ultras where there's a lot more hiking and stuff. I think I'm way more patient and forward movement is positive movement mentality, and that's still how you get ultras done and still how you win ultras as well. Where I think in the past I was just rushed to get going, rushed to start running fast, to feel fast, to be running fast, and essentially sometimes that makes you pretty tired.
I realize that I probably shouldn't make any assumptions. Do you still see yourself as being in your physical prime?
Yeah, I think I can do anything I've done in the past, and if not, like, better, and keep improving on it. And like, not to mention just right now with the current athletes winning it, it feels like everyone's my age or older, in a lot of ways. Like, people in their 30s, I think, are really doing well right now. So it doesn't make me feel old at all, or like any way like that. I think you just see Killian Jornet winning, and Sierra's now in the fashion that he did, like probably one of his
Insane.
hardest earned wins out of the 10 he has. But at the same time, it's still the end result, it's still a fast time, and yeah, I guess there's people like that to look forward and look up to.
If you believe the GAP on some of those miles, he should give Alan Webb a call, because he could probably run a pretty fast mile. There were some allegedly some 348 GAPs. It was insane.
Yeah, I don't think the algorithm's quite right on grade adjusted pace, but the uphill at Sears now is really special. It's just such good footing. It really lets you just go full gas, and like there's not rocks or anything getting in your way. It's grippy. It's usually, I think it's pretty cool start, or actually it's pretty warm start in Sierra there. It's pretty low, but yeah, I don't know. I think yeah, it's just a good gradient, good footing. So there's not having to worry about footwork so much with it too. I think different uphills, like the gradient, like the percentage could be the same and stuff, but they don't all run the same, and there's no way to really account for that.
Would you ever do, in the next couple of years, a dedicated Golden Trail Series season?
It's crossed my mind. It's something that especially Europeans bring up, to go focus on Golden Trail and do some shorter stuff. I mean, it feels like it's a young trail runner sport more so. I think I could compete with it, but it's not quite as exciting. Whereas if I focus on ultra, I feel like I can become more dominant in this, and kind of put more big wins on like the overall career, rather than just getting distracted with a goal of like, so what, you did Golden Trail. Like, I would say in trail running, it's just not as prestigious, and part of that's how it works. So the rotating races, there's not history in it. They're trying to figure out how to film it, produce it, present it to like an organizing body, and do this. So it's kind of finding its identity. And then I would say also, then you have to look at the Zagamas, the Mont Blanc 42K, the Sierras and Als, and those are more the traditional ones, because Solomon's always gone to those races with a bunch of organization following Killian, because those are the races he wants to do. So with their long commitment, they've created a lot of history with that the last 10, 15 years. But I mean, Sierras and Als, I think, is well over 50 years old.
So the mental aspect has been a big difference maker in recent years. I know, back in like the late 2010s, early 2020s, in those sort of middle years at UTMB, you were commenting on like vulnerabilities in like longer mountain races, colder conditions, because running comes more naturally to you, but maybe the steep stuff, becoming one with the poles, doesn't. Are there other ways that you want to continue to grow in the sport and just become like a more well-rounded athlete, or is it still focused on like the minutia of the UTMB course in that environment?
I think it'll be, well, kind of leaning in, could be the minutia of this environment, but still learning how to do harder ultras, longer ultras. I think that will make me better at the 100-mile distance too, and more versatile. I mean, then there's even Western States and other 100-milers, where when you look at the times and stuff, like, they're fast. It's not slow per se. So whereas UTMB, there is walking. There's a lot of strength to it, and but then as you go further and further, you kind of learn how to keep persevering longer, and this mentality to endure kind of takes over.
You mentioned Hardrock earlier, and at least one of my observations was that it was, I don't want to use that word. It was like the old person Olympics. It was just amazing to see, like, at least on the men's side, for example, Ludo not only take care of business, but set a course record. Jason Schlarb sort of have a renaissance there and get on the podium. It was just amazing. And so when you see people like that, when you see people like Francois, they're still at the forefront of the sport in their late 30s, with Ludo late 40s. Does it change timelines or shift your perspective on how long you can be at the top of the sport for?
Yeah. Well, when you compare to Ludo, all of a sudden it's like, whoa, you really want to do UTMB, Hardrock sort of races for another 15 years, and I think that's kind of hard to grasp. So I'm not sure. Probably like to do it more for fun before 15 years, but we'll see. Depends kind of how the body holds up, how life changes and stuff. But yeah, guys like Jason and Ludo definitely give you hope to keep competing. And I think it again goes to show the part of trail running that's endurance focused and strength based, that's more technical, vertical mountain ultras, or perhaps really hard conditions, whether it be really hot and vertical, and or just really technical, something that just makes it slower and strength based. I think age is less of a number in that sort of game of the sport, and I think that's where essentially the younger you can master that, the longer you kind of create this niche for yourself to protect that zone. And I guess that's where kind of I see myself really trying to just focus of like, well, if I can compete against, like, bring in the younger aspect into this strength endurance side of the sport, all of a sudden you could be 5-10 plus years kind of dominating that zone. And I would say to protect, like, being on top of that is more realistic than, well, Killian's pulled it off, but protecting being on top of the Golden Trail sort of series, I think it's pretty difficult. Just a lot of speed in that. But they do a good job with pulling in unique and technical courses. Whereas if then you say, like, well, how many years can you be on top of Way Too Cool? It's kind of like, well, how many years can you be the top marathoner in the States? Like, it doesn't last forever.
Unless you're Bernard Lagat.
I mean, he's not the top marathoner. He competed on the track pretty old. Like, yeah, you have Bernard Lagat, Nick Willis, that are older on the track. But typically the track is kind of in the 20s. Most 5K world records are set by people about 21 years old, where kind of VO2 max tops out. And then, yeah, I mean, even Jakob Ingebrigtsen's on top of the 1500, and he still gets, like, he ran 3:26 this year, and still misses the podium at the Olympics. Like, it's a competitive world, and tough. You got to be sharp and really on top of it. So, yeah, I think it's just a more manageable skill that creates a longer career and path to master kind of just the endurance, strength, I mean, just health-wise, and then talk about adventuring and exploring. Like, truly, I mean, yeah, now we're talking, like, walking and hiking is really like how you, with a pack and poles, is really how you go further as a human, and just like how far can you go and keep going, and just all you gotta do is refuel. I mean, it kind of starts now evolving into the fast packing sort of world that I've always been interested in, because a lot of people that come in from that direction come in with such different strengths than what I feel like I associated with growing up in the sport, like this fast speed. And I think, you're trying to marriage the two of it, you become pretty hard to beat when you're fast and you're, I guess, clever enough to be strong and have that endurance to kind of start competing there.
Just a few more questions before UTMB stuff, I promise. Kind of the perfect segue. I know that you had or it looks like you had the chance to do a little bit of recon with Francois on the Tour de Géants course. Thinking about the takeaways from the experience, was it more like, this is cool terrain, or was it more like, maybe my timeline for doing this race one day has been significantly shortened?
The tour course was sweet. So I kind of did the last third or last half with Francois. It's just, I would say, a more entertaining, more engaging trail that's smaller, more technical. Typically, it has less time flat in the valley before it starts just going up and down again. So, I mean, yeah, and then I think even talking with Francois, like, Thor kind of advertised it a little lowball on the vert as well. Looking
Wow.
at it, it's either 26 or 28,000 meters, not 24 like they say. So I think the GPX that I have is 208 miles and about 84,000 feet of vert. So it just absolutely clobbers the amount of vertical you're getting at UTMB. So yeah, that was really interesting. I think 208 miles, talking 60-hour race at best. It's really hard to comprehend at this point. I think that kind of goes to how other athletes have really stretched their elasticity like really well in this long endurance category, and I think that's really intriguing to me. But also, I just don't know when or how to do it, and who knows? Maybe it'll just be just spur of the moment, jump in on the deep end. We'll see.
One last question on sort of like the career theme. I love the phrase you used a moment ago, protecting the zone. That can sort of stretch out your career, make your career more elastic, at least in a specific area of the sport. And we've talked about it in other interviews. Maybe 2 years ago, we talked about it pre-UTMB, but there were so many comments earlier in your career that your time in the sport, at least at an elite level, it would be pretty short-lived because of your style, your approach. You kind of went off the deep end in terms of speed, but you've managed to string together this amazing, like 8 to 9 years of pretty consistent greatness. Do you attribute that to everything we kind of talked about in the first part of the combo here, where it's like the mental strength, adjusting to new realities? Did you make changes with longevity in mind, or has it been luck? Like, what do you attribute that to?
I mean, I think ignorance is powerful for one. So just not paying attention to like if it will be the same next year or not. I think you can't like plan to slow down. You have to just kind of deal with it when you do start slowing down and adjust as necessary. So I think I've kind of said you got to cook when the pan is hot. So if the pan's hot, you got to keep cooking on it. And kind of also when you get on a hot streak, like there's been times where you find a really good training block, and then all of a sudden, you're setting up like several races in a row that will, as long as you kind of recover, you can just tick, tick, tick a
Wow.
couple in a row. And so that kind of goes to setting up like off seasons, and then kind of that base building, like just consistency, boredom, vanilla training, day after day, grinding away. It can really set up like the foundation for the next training block, or even like one training block with a little different than just the race in front of you, and kind of starting to get ready for the block after that if you have something in mind. But I think I've slowed down comparatively to the first couple years I was in the sport as far as racing, but I think that kind of comes with the pressure when I do line up, and a lot of pressure that I put on myself. Just I expect myself to perform at a high level. I expect to compete for a win at an ultra, and yeah, I expect to run fast. So yeah, it's not like you want to go in half-assed to races, and it yeah, you just have to prepare for things and make sure that you know what you're getting into.
I feel like you, at least from what I could tell, like watching the early movies back in like 2016, it feels like even then you were holding yourself to a pretty high standard. So it's interesting to hear you say that you put even more pressure on yourself now.
Or I would say I've put a lot of pressure on myself since the beginning. I was saying comparatively to like outside pressure, I put a lot of pressure on myself. So,
Gotcha.
it's good and stressful. Not necessarily bad, but sometimes stressful. And yeah, you kind of feel the balance of you need to take a step back and not take it so serious and relax and still enjoy some of the good times during the whole process.
How much better do you think the whole sport is, like your competitors in 2024 to where the field was in 2016 when you were lined up at races like Western? Because I know we talked earlier about like, okay, maybe like gear was different, training knowledge was different, et cetera, but there was still the people, right? So do you think the sport's a lot deeper now? Is it about the same? Like, how do you square all that?
I'm not sure it's deeper as far as talent, but I mean, if you judge by time, which, yeah, I mean, this year's Western States was incredibly fast and a pretty hot year. It was a few degrees warmer than 2016, and I guess course conditions were actually eerily similar to 2016 as well. So it was pretty interesting. But I would say a lot of people, um, myself included, like we blew up in the heat in some way or another. So I mean, the winning time was 15:30ish. So like, whereas this year you just didn't see as many blowups, and then it's deep enough still that you have a really competitive front top 10, all pushing fast times historically. So yeah, I think it also goes with the preparedness, like how many in the top 10, I guess, were debutants, and take that at like mile at Robinson Flat, maybe, of just top 10
Hmm.
first 100 milers. And historically, Western States has always played a role of introducing the fast runners to 100 miles. And that's kind of one of its historically beautiful storylines, is the up and coming fast guys, marathoners getting their chance at, now you get to race ultra, but oh, by the way, it's 100 degrees out and you got to keep up. And like, yeah, it's pretty hot, and it's not possible to run 15-minute 5Ks throughout the day at Western State. So, um, whereas now they've changed, like basically every golden ticket race is at least 100K. They've pushed for that, I think, kind of culturally and on the board and stuff. But I think I've heard that like Way Too Cool 50K used to be a Montreal Cup race, like way back
Yeah.
when, and it used to bring like some of the most exciting kind of wild horses into the race and storylines. And I mean, people hated on Lake Sonoma for a while, just that. Oh, and I'm one of the people. Like, I qualified in 2016, and then DNF, or not DNF, but yeah, it didn't go well. That people that are qualifying on the 50 mile just can't handle 100 miles and this and that, but it's all the same athletes for the most part. We're all committing to hours out there, and kind of slower volume based stuff. And so it's a matter of just kind of getting the rhythm to the 100 mile right, and not all 100 miles have the same rhythm.
I got to ask you a fun question because you just reminded me. We do this little mini series on the show called the Long Run Archives, and the latest one that we did, one of the topics we debated was whether we should just kill the entire idea of an auto return top 10 to Western States and throw all 10 spots on the men's side, including the winner, and the women's side back into the Golden Ticket Series and expand the field back into that like Montreal Cup old day thing, even though obviously top 10 returns still existed back then too, but like broaden the field. And I'd love to get your take. Do you like the idea of having to earn your way back into the race every year? Do you like securing spots for the year? Where do you stand on that?
I think the top 10 is pretty important for Western States. I think when you look at sports and superstars, like essentially people returning that people are familiar with is kind of what creates people to cheer for. So without people returning, I think some of the excitement really dies off, and just to be able to follow the sport would become so complicated and so revolving that it just wouldn't. I don't think it would work as well. I think sports that end up just growing, typically they have superstars that kind of stay in the sport and stay on top quite often and are quite relevant, and I think that's kind of how the top 10 at Western States works. So, it brings back familiar faces and kind of encourages that. If you have to race in every year, that's asking a bit much, I think, when, all right, this is year 5 and stuff, like, come
on. Moving on, we talked after your win last year, and it wasn't quite a foregone conclusion yet whether you'd be back. Like you indicated, you were sort of shopping around, considering all options. I know even races like Ultra Trail Monte Rosa were top of mind. When did it become clear to you that you would for sure be back on the start line this year for UTMB?
I mean, it's been a goal since last year. I think giving it a lot of thought is just that I don't know how many more wins at the top essentially I'll have, and just I don't want to take it for granted that I have these opportunities. So it became a goal pretty like right at the end of last year. Like just nothing else felt equivalent. So when you start considering like where to put your time and energy, like UTMB is the biggest race. So where I guess I'll have to rewind. As Americans, I think it's worthy to put our time and energy into Western States and having this championship American race as well. And I think it's incredibly worth our time to protect that as a global competitive race that we represents like kind of our side of the sport as well.
In years past, when you felt good in that stretch between Western and UTMB, I know you've talked about having that sort of carrot to push your limits in training. And I think the trade-off there was like when things got tough on race day at UTMB, you maybe didn't have that freshness to, have that like second wind. Do you feel like you took more recovery after Western this time around?
Yeah, I guess is numerically, data-wise, for sure. I had to take a lot more recovery in between these races. Of just every recovery after ultras is unique, and it hasn't been the smoothest transition so far. So, it's been a lot more recovery-based, a lot less training-based in between, and there's still things to do between now and UTMB in 2 weeks to kind of figure it out.
Talk about that when you say it wasn't a smooth transition. What were some of the factors at play?
Just like injury stuff from the race. I would say I've had some inflammation problems and having to deal with figuring out how to train or can I train or what can I do and this and that. So just figuring out how to do what I can manage in between the two races and kind of like just start working with the cards you're dealt. It's a quick turnaround. I think it's been 3 years since I've tried to do the double, and it's hard. Doing both races back to back, you got to hope that everything goes pretty smoothly and stuff. throws a bunch of wrenches in just this, like, the last 2 years I've had a really long focus build up on UTMB, and it's just kind of weird not to have that this year.
Yeah. It reminds me, I've heard you say, and maybe it was last year actually, and maybe you were talking about it as a function of sort of creating a better mindset going into UTMB. I've heard you say that being a little scared going into this race is a good thing. Talk about that, because that's an interesting way to frame sort of your competitive mindset going into like the biggest race in our sport.
I think in a lot of ways, when I have a bit more hesitation, I tend to just run a bit more tactically and a bit more strategic. And I think that, just like anyone, it puts you in a better position if you're making smarter, more conservative decisions instead of being a bit more bullish and brash and trying to just muscle through, like, breaking other people throughout the race and stuff. And I think I've tried to do that in UTMB's past. And sure, like, we can get away for a bit, but then, like, say in 2017, Francois and I got away from Killian, and like we had him gapped and everything and running away, and then all of a sudden wheels fall off for me, and not having this just smooth mentality to that the race is a lot longer. It's not about breaking someone in the moment. And then you see Killian still pretty much go stride for stride of, like, he lost 10-15 minutes behind Francois, but then the last 30-40K he didn't lose any more time. Like, they went minute per minute all the way to the finish, and I think that kind of goes to show, like, both of those guys had a lot more experience than me in 2017.
You've been Strava Dark since April, mostly Strava Dark in the lead up to this race, even going back to last year. I'm asking this totally from a position of curiosity, not judgment, either positive or negative. What's the rationale for keeping your work towards this race private?
I think I've just liked not being in the spotlight as much. I think sometimes my training just gets too much chatter and talk and excitement, and it, I guess, counters to that. When I'm not logging my training, it just feels like I get overlooked a lot and forgotten, and so it feels like a bit less pressure. Like, people can talk this and that, but the rest is just kind of like guessing, and we'll just figure out, like, what happens on race day happens on race day, and kind of let that speak for itself.
I know last year wasn't perfect. There was that, watching the race, there was that 15, I think it was like a 15-minute swing sort of back and forth on the course with Zach after Courmayeur or Arnaz. But then you ran that last 50K pretty amazing. When you think about areas of improvement this time around, is it simply about smoothing out your effort? Do you start the race more aggressively? How are you thinking about that component? Or is it just racing tactically and sticking with whoever's in the lead?
I think I'm not thinking about as much, like, more and more these days. I don't think about the start of the race. It's more about just hanging in there, following your nutrition plan and keeping an eye on what's happening, being aware. It'll be interesting if someone takes a swinger and, like, starts going pretty early, pretty fast. Like, that puts you in a bit of a situation. Essentially what I used to do a lot of, like, well, do you go out or do you not? And typically you probably go out probably with a little bit of caution, but other than that, like, you just really need to pace yourself and take care of yourself, because you'll have to see how they're doing 10 hours later, if they still feel that build to keep pushing. Whereas last year, I think it was a similar front pack that we had the last few years, and kind of everything was shaking out very similar to the last few UTMBs I've had, and so I just knew, like, hard times were coming. And yeah, Grand Col Ferret, just going down to La Poulie, continues to kind of be a low moment for me. That's easier to plan for because I know it's coming. I know I'm not going to feel good. Whereas, like, I think even originally looking at the UTMB course, it was always looking at the descent, and you're like, man, you could just rip that. But at the same time, I think it's early morning, the sun's not quite up yet. stomach, it's cold pass. Stomach's usually not doing as well. So last year there was a lot of just waiting. It's not time to kind of go all chips in yet. So that kind of goes to just seeing what sort of adjustments you can make, and then I guess looking forward to the last 50K where it gets a bit steeper on the last 3 climbs. I think the race, like, the skills for the last 3 climbs are a bit different, and you have to. That's where like the strength is really gonna come through. So, just kind of mentally preparing for a long day and 3 climbs at the end of UTMB. I think it'll kind of be something similar. Just not trying to spend the money early, save it for when you get back to France on the loop.
It's awesome to hear your mindset now in 2024, because before this interview, the YouTube algorithm served me up I think it was the 2017 UTMB highlight video. And one of my favorite scenes is from early on when I think you're like walking into Saint Gervais and you just stop for a couple minutes and you're waiting for quite a while for Killian and maybe Francois and Zach, the rest of the leaders, to come through. Do you ever just kind of laugh at just like the change in strategy that happened, between that stretch of time?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely bring that up amongst friends of just how it was my first time like really racing a big race in Europe against Killian, against Francois, and I just thought the intensity of the downhill was just going to be full gas, and just I was mentally ready for it. I had splits for first 50K, and then I have splits for the first 50K, and we'll just go, we'll things will start shaping out after that, or first 100K. You have splits, and then you just like, well, we'll deal with the last 50K when we get to it, but kind of completely inverse now of just we'll figure out the first 100K and we'll kind of deal with that, but then we just know we got to wake up the last 60K and start racing from there on in. Whereas I completely ripped down the descent from Les Houches to Saint Gervais, which is one of the smaller climbs, but really, really steep on both ends. And definitely a quad burner on the descent. And I actually even stopped and talked with Megan Hicks for a little bit. She was on the descent further up, and I was just like, I don't know where they went. Like, I thought they were right behind me, and then I get to Saint Gervais, and like I'm waiting for 3 more minutes, and then it's also an example of kind of just not thinking and not experience. And essentially, like, Killian comes in, he just runs through the aid station, and he's already got his headlight on, and then I'm like, I should have got my headlight out. And so I take my bag, and just how disorganized I was, like, took my bag off, reached in to grab my headlight, put on my headlight, and then had to catch up to him. So like I actually lost time on that after like probably having 4 or 5 minutes on the descent.
So we're recording this a little less than 2 weeks before race day. I know last year I thought it was pretty cool, even though, as a member of the media, I would have loved the chance to talk pre-race. Are you going to go sort of media dark in the week leading up? Are you going to kind of shut things off and ditch your phone and screens and just like be zen about the days leading up? Or what's your plan to handle sort of the hustle and bustle of Chamonix?
Yeah. Well, we're renting the same place we had last year. So some things are pretty familiar, and kind of how to get in town, how to get out of town. Least impactful, because there's definitely like not interviews, like events that I have to be at, whether it's sort of thing that they just post them in the middle of Chamonix, and it's a bit of a lot going on in town, and everybody's ultra runners that are very excited to be there. Like the elites are included in that too, so it's just a lot of energy for the sport going on there. That's pretty cool and unique, but it's nice to be tucked away from that. The plans to just try to manage things, do a couple interviews before, but try to keep it as low key as possible, and then not a lot going on the phone. We'll see. but just playing low key, do what I need to, and try to keep the feet up.
I know it's kind of stupid to look super far out in the future, but I'm wondering if this could be your last UTMB for a bit, because next year the World Trail Champs are going to be in the Pyrenees, basically in the same like corridor of time. And I have to imagine that it's not something you would want to miss. I could be wrong, but are you approaching this UTMB like there could be a 2-year hiatus because of the World Trail Champs?
I'm not treating it as such. I think I'm just taking it this year, 1 year at a time. The World Trail Champs is really intriguing next year. I think there's a month. I think it's a month after UTMB. I think they're both in September. But so yeah, it's really, really quick turnaround. I think the US hasn't even announced which races to race in, so it's quite unorganized on the American side so far, and how to get in, because I guess to race in would be kind of nice only because like I don't have to ask for a delegation spot like I did last time, and then something popped up and changed my mind. Whereas if you race in, like, well, you earned it, and I think then you can choose what to do with the spot. But yeah, if someone else wanted to race, and they had to beat you on the day, so that's a bit interesting to me. I'm kind of waiting to see what they release, because yeah, you got to start planning. I mean, just winter training, and when you need to be ready, if that's something that I'm going to consider. So yeah, that's a bit odd. And then as of now, the plan's probably to go back to Western States in June. So that's going to take out a training block in a race schedule, and so we'll see. I think both UTMB and the World Champs are going to be really intriguing races next year, and both will be worthwhile to focus on no matter which way.
Last question for you. To the extent that you were following the Summer Olympics this past month, what was your favorite moment?
I mean, the 1500, the men's 1500 was pretty crazy. Or the American gold for cycling was pretty sweet on the women's side. But in the finish line of the marathon, I think people were like, "Oh, how pretty is this arch and stuff." But then the finish line for cycling, it had the Eiffel Tower perfectly framed up in the background. Like, that was pretty sweet. But the Cole Hawker getting the men's 1500 was pretty insane. I was watching that one. So yeah, I ended up missing, I think, the 5K because I was in Italy and I couldn't figure out how to stream it, that. So but in France, I'm able to stream it. So yeah, that one was a really big surprise, and even Yared finishing third, and Hobbs taking fifth. He's a young guy that trains in Flagstaff, so pretty cool to see.
Right on. Well, Jim, we appreciate your time. Wishing you the best of luck at UTMB later this month. And yeah, thanks again. Thanks as always.
Yeah, thanks so much, and hope the next few weeks goes smooth for you.